On their fifth wedding anniversary, while she was 7 months pregnant, her husband handed her divorce papers, $10,000, and told her to get out, tonight. In the rain, his mother showed up with champagne and cardboard boxes. She walked into the nursery and threw every piece of baby clothing into a trash bag while Grace watched. Then the other woman arrived in a red designer dress and started measuring the windows for new curtains. They gave her 60 minutes to erase 5 years of her life. She walked out into the rain with a suitcase, a wet check, and a locket she had worn since she was 6 months old, the only thing that survived the car accident that killed her parents. Her husband called her background noise. His mother called her a stray cat. They were absolutely certain she was nobody, with nothing, going nowhere. But that locket held a secret that connected her to a name so powerful, so wealthy, so far beyond anything the Crawford family could imagine, that when the truth finally came out in a courtroom in front of a judge with 5 attorneys and a billionaire grandfather sitting behind her, her husband's entire empire didn't just crack. It collapsed, and he never saw it coming. Lesson and value. This story is proof of one truth that never changes. Your worth is not decided by the person who walks away from you. It is revealed by what you do after they leave. Never let someone else's cruelty become your identity. If this story gave you chills, drop a comment and tell me, what moment made your jaw drop? Hit that like button so this story reaches someone who needs to hear it tonight. Share it with a friend who deserves to know she is not nothing. And subscribe if you want more stories that hit different, because this channel does not do ordinary. I will see you in the next one. Dylan Crawford didn't just want to end his marriage. He wanted to erase it. He wanted to scrub every trace of his wife from his life the way you'd power wash a stain off a driveway, quickly, thoroughly, and without a second thought. He looked at the woman sitting across the living room, the woman who had washed his shirts and cooked his meals and carried his child for 7 months, a woman he believed was a penniless orphan he had rescued from a life of bus stops and ramen noodles, and he felt nothing, less than nothing. He felt the mild irritation of a man who has outgrown a pair of shoes and can't understand why they're still in his closet. But Dylan made one fatal mistake. He confused silence with stupidity. He mistook kindness for weakness, and he assumed that a woman with no money, no family, and no last name worth remembering could never, ever fight back. He had no idea that the signature on those divorce papers wouldn't just end a marriage. It would detonate a bomb that would level everything he had ever built, every lie he had ever told, and every cruel word he had ever whispered in the dark. This is the story of how a man threw away a queen to chase a pawn. And this is the story of how that queen burned his kingdom to the ground without ever raising her voice. The envelope was thick, creamy white, and unmistakably legal. It sat on the mahogany coffee table, exactly where a vase of flowers should have been. It was October 14th, a Wednesday, and it was Grace and Dylan Crawford's 5th wedding anniversary. Grace stood in the center of the living room of their Upper East Side townhouse, her hands still damp from washing the dishes. She had cooked Dylan's favorite meal, herb-roasted chicken with garlic mashed potatoes, homemade bread rolls, and a salad with the imported olive oil he liked. The dining table behind her was set for 2. White candles, a small anniversary card she had spent an hour writing by hand, and propped against a vase of grocery store daisies, the only flowers she could afford because Dylan controlled every dollar in the household, was the sonogram photo of their daughter. 28 weeks, a perfect profile, 10 tiny fingers. Grace was 32 years old. At 7 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand frequently resting on the curve of her belly. She was wearing her one nice maternity dress, a navy blue cotton dress from Target that cost $30. She had saved for it by skipping lunches for 2 weeks, telling Elena she wasn't hungry, packing a granola bar in her purse instead. Dylan wouldn't have noticed if she'd worn a burlap sack. Dylan hadn't really looked at her in over a year. She heard his key in the lock at 9:47. He was 3 hours late. She had texted him twice. The chicken had dried out at 8:30. She had turned the oven off at 9. The front door opened, and the sound of expensive shoes on hardwood echoed through the foyer. Dylan Crawford walked in carrying a gust of cold October air and the faint scent of whiskey and a perfume that was not Grace's. He was a handsome man, in the way a razor is handsome, sharp, clean, and designed to cut. Dark hair, strong jaw, a body maintained by a personal trainer Grace was not allowed to use because, as Dylan put it, why would you need a gym membership when you get your exercise scrubbing the bathroom floor? He didn't look at Grace. He didn't look at the dinner table. He didn't look at the sonogram. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and then turned and leaned against the sideboard with the expression of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task, like filing taxes or putting down a dog. He gestured at the coffee table with his glass. "You've seen it, then?" Grace looked at the envelope. She didn't need to open it. The atmosphere in this house had been dying for months, maybe years. The late nights that bled into early mornings, the new passcode on his phone that changed every week, the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder, as if her fingers were made of something unclean. She picked up the sonogram photo from the table where the envelope had been dropped on top of it. She wiped a crease from the corner and held it against her chest. "Happy anniversary, Dylan," she said softly. Her voice was steady, composed, a clear, quiet stream running over rocks. It was the voice that had always irritated Dylan because he could never crack it, never make it shake, never hear the satisfying sound of a woman breaking. Dylan let out a short, ugly laugh. "God, you're pathetic." Even now, no screaming, no throwing things, just happy anniversary. He took a long sip of bourbon and grimaced. "This is exactly why we're done, Grace. You have no fire, no ambition. You're furniture. You're the beige paint on a wall that nobody looks at." Grace held the sonogram a little tighter. "Is that what the papers say? Irreconcilable differences due to beige paint?" "They say whatever my lawyers drafted them to say," Dylan snapped. He set his glass down, hard on the sideboard, and a ring of bourbon splashed onto the polished wood. Grace's eyes flicked to it automatically, years of training making her want to wipe it up. She didn't move. "The point is, it's over. I've outgrown you, Grace. It happens. Stocks rise, stocks fall. You were a good investment when I was a junior associate and needed someone who kept the house clean and didn't ask questions. But I'm a name partner now. I close deals with people who summer in the Hamptons. I sit across the table from senators and CEOs. I need a wife who fits that world. Someone who can host a gala. Someone who walks into a room and people notice. Not someone who looks like she should be serving the appetizers." "Jettona." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Grace didn't flinch. She had heard variations of the speech for years, the slow drip of cruelty that Dylan dispensed, like a prescription. "You're lucky I found you. You'd be nothing without me. You have no family, no education, no history. I gave you everything. The least you can do is be grateful." "And your daughter?" Grace asked. She placed her hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a tiny foot or fist pushing against her palm. Dylan waved his hand in the air like he was swatting a fly. "Your daughter. I'll pay whatever the court says. $800 a month sounds about right for someone at your income level, which, let's be honest, is zero. Without me, you're back at the diner, Grace. That's just reality. Grace looked at the envelope. What are the terms? Generous, Dylan said, and he actually smiled. It was the smile of a man who believes he is being magnanimous while handing someone a grenade. You get $10,000, cash. Consider it severance pay for 5 years of service. You keep your clothes, your little locket thing, whatever junk you brought into this marriage, and you leave tonight. Tonight? Tonight. Dylan, it's raining. I'm 7 months pregnant, and Brittany's decorators arrive at 9 tomorrow morning. I want your things gone. I want your smell gone. That cheap soap you use because you claim you have sensitive skin. I want to open my closet and not see a single Target clearance tag. Grace looked at him. She really looked at him, the way you look at them, something for the last time. Memorizing the details, not out of love, but out of a need to remember what the danger looked like. She saw the bourbon-flushed cheeks, the hard, empty eyes, the expensive watch she had given him for their 3rd anniversary, bought with money she saved from the grocery budget by eating less so he could eat more. Can I at least stay until morning? She asked, not begging, just asking. No. The doorbell rang. Dylan's face changed. The irritation smoothed into something else, a flicker of anticipation, like a child who hears the ice cream truck. He walked to the door and opened it. Margaret Crawford stood on the threshold. She was 63 years old, thin as a whip, and dressed in a cream cashmere coat that she wore like a suit of armor. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her lips were pressed into a smile that had all the warmth of a closed bank vault. She was carrying a bottle of champagne in one hand and a stack of empty cardboard boxes in the other. Oh, good, Margaret said, walking past Dylan without waiting to be invited in. She didn't look at Grace. She hadn't looked directly at Grace since the wedding, when she had told her son, in a whisper, loud enough for the entire first row to hear, that marrying a foster child was like adopting a stray cat. It might seem noble at first, but eventually, you'd find hair on the furniture and regret it. She's still here, Margaret continued, setting the champagne on the counter with a decisive clink. I brought boxes. Let's get this moving. Margaret, Grace began. Don't. Margaret said sharply, finally turning to face her. She looked at Grace the way a health inspector looks at a cockroach on a kitchen counter. I've waited 5 years for this night, Grace. 5 years of watching my son waste himself on a woman who contributes nothing, who has nothing, who is nothing. So please spare me the waterworks and start packing. Margaret picked up the boxes and walked toward the stairs. Grace watched her, a cold dread settling into her stomach. Where are you going? Grace asked. The nursery, Margaret said over her shoulder. Brittany's already picked out the new theme. We need to clear out all that secondhand junk. Grace moved as fast as her pregnant body would allow. She reached the nursery doorway just in time to see Margaret pulling things off the shelves. The nursery was Grace's one sanctuary in the house, the one room Dylan had let her decorate because he had no interest in baby things. She had painted butterflies on the walls herself, soft yellows and pale pinks, spending hours on a stepladder with a foam brush. The crib was second-hand from a thrift store. Grace had sanded it down and repainted it white, spending 3 weekends to get the finish smooth enough that no splinters could ever touch her baby's skin. On the shelves were a small stack of onesies she had bought one at a time from Goodwill, each one washed twice and folded with care. Margaret picked up the stack of baby clothes. She held them at arm's length as if they smelled and dropped them into a black trash bag. Margaret, please, Grace said, and her voice cracked for the first time. Those are for the baby. Margaret looked at her with an expression of pure distilled contempt. Brittany will outfit this nursery properly. Pottery Barn, not Goodwill. This room will have proper furniture for a proper family. Grace gripped the doorframe. What do you mean, a proper family? Margaret smiled. It was the cruelest expression Grace had ever seen on a human face. Oh, didn't Dylan tell you? Brittany is 2 months along. A boy, they think. You didn't really believe you were special, did you, Grace? You were the placeholder, the practice wife, the rough draft before the real thing. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at Dylan, who had appeared in the hallway behind her. He was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone with one thumb. Is that true? Grace whispered. Dylan didn't look up. Does it matter? Sign the papers, Grace. Take the money. Go. Grace stood in the half-destroyed nursery, one hand on the doorframe, one hand on her belly, where her daughter was kicking, alive and oblivious, and depending entirely on a mother who had just been told she was disposable. The trash bag at Margaret's feet held every piece of clothing Grace had bought for her unborn child. She looked at Dylan, bored in the hallway. She looked at Margaret, triumphant by the crib, and something inside Grace, something that had been bending for 5 years under the weight of silence and gratitude and please don't leave me because I have nowhere else to go, that something didn't break. It went quiet. I'll pack, Grace said. She walked to the bedroom. She pulled her battered suitcase from the back of the closet, the same suitcase she had brought into this marriage 5 years ago. She packed 3 changes of clothes. She packed the photo of her parents, a grainy, faded image of a man and woman she had never known, standing in front of a garden she couldn't identify. She had carried this photo through 6 foster homes, 2 group homes, and 1 marriage. It was the only proof she had that she had once been wanted by someone. And she packed the small wooden jewelry box. Inside the box, resting on faded velvet, was a platinum locket, heavy, old, finely crafted. On the front was an engraving she had never been able to fully identify. It looked like a bird, maybe an eagle, clutching something in its talons. On the back were 3 initials, WWRB. The locket was the only thing she had from her biological parents. A social worker had given it to her when she was 6, told her it had been in the car when they found her after the accident that killed her parents. Grace had worn it every day of her life. Dylan called it costume jewelry. Margaret had once called it worthless junk. Grace put the locket around her neck and tucked it under her dress. She left every diamond Dylan had ever bought her in a neat pile on his pillow. The engagement ring, the tennis bracelet he gave her as an apology for missing Christmas, the earrings from their first anniversary that he forgot he had bought because his secretary picked them out. She carried her suitcase downstairs. The living room had changed. Brittany Voss had arrived. She was 28, blonde, spray-tanned, to the color of a butterscotch candy, and wearing a red designer dress that probably cost more than Grace's entire wardrobe combined. She was walking through the living room, pointing at things, and dictating changes to someone on her phone. The sofa goes, Brittany was saying, and all this gray, it's so depressing. I want cream and gold, and get rid of that dining set. It smells like... She paused, looking up as Grace came down the stairs, pregnant belly and suitcase and all. Brittany's eyes went wide for a theatrical second, and then her face arranged itself into a mask of exaggerated sympathy. Oh, wow, you're huge, Brittany said, lowering her phone. Don't worry, sweetie. I'll take great care of the nursery. I'm thinking all white, very clean, very fresh start. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, holding the champagne. She popped the cork. The sound echoed through the townhouse like a starting pistol. Grace set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the 3 of them. Dylan on the sofa, arms stretched along the back, one ankle on his knee, the king of his castle. Brittany beside him, draping herself over the armrest like a trophy on a shelf. Margaret pouring champagne into glasses, her thin lips curved in satisfaction. 3 people celebrating the disposal of a pregnant woman. Grace walked to the door. She stopped. She didn't turn around fully, just enough so her voice would carry. You broke the contract, Dylan. Not me. Remember that? Get out, Dylan said. His voice was flat, bored, final. Grace opened the door. The rain hit her like a wall of cold water. October in New York was not gentle. The sky was black, the streetlights smeared into halos by the downpour, and the sidewalk was already pooling with runoff from the gutters. Grace stepped outside, one hand pulling her suitcase, the other resting on her belly. The door slammed behind her. She heard the lock click. Then, muffled through the wood and glass, she heard laughter. Grace stood on the sidewalk. The rain soaked her hair in seconds, plastering it to her skull, running in cold streams down her face and neck. Her $30 maternity dress clung to her body. Her shoes, the only pair of flats she owned, were already filling with water. To anyone watching from the windows of the neighboring brownstones, she looked exactly like what Dylan and Margaret and Brittany said she was. A discarded woman, a throwaway, a charity case who had finally outlived her usefulness. She stood there for a long moment. Then she shifted her grip on the suitcase and began to walk. She didn't hail a cab. She couldn't afford one. She walked 6 blocks through the rain to Elena Ruiz's apartment. Elena Ruiz opened her door at 10:15 on a Wednesday night and found her best friend standing in the hallway looking like something the East River had spat out. Grace was soaked from head to toe, her hair hanging in dark ropes, her maternity dress clinging to the hard, round shape of her belly. She was holding a battered suitcase in one hand and a wet check for $10,000 in the other. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry and distant, focused on something Elena couldn't see. Elena didn't ask questions. She didn't say, "Oh my God," or "What happened," or "Are you okay?" Because the answer to the last question was obviously no, and the answers to the first two were written in every line of Grace's exhausted face. Elena pulled her inside, took the suitcase, pushed her onto the couch, and wrapped her in every blanket the apartment owned. Then she made tea, put the mug in Grace's hands, and sat down across from her on the floor. "Talk when you're ready," Elena said. "Or don't talk. Either way, you're not going back out in that rain." Grace held the tea. The warmth seeped into her fingers. The baby kicked, hard, probably complaining about the cold, and Grace rubbed the spot with her palm. "He served me papers," Grace said quietly. "On our anniversary, while I was 7 months pregnant with his daughter. His mother threw away the baby's clothes. His girlfriend is redecorating the nursery." Elena's face went through about 6 different expressions in 3 seconds, the last of which settled into the cold, focused rage of a woman who was mentally constructing a to-do list that started with arson and ended with a shallow grave. "I'm going to kill him," Elena said. "No, you're not." "I'm going to kill his mother." "Elena, fine. I'm going to key his car. He'll just buy a new one." Elena clenched her jaw so hard Grace could hear her teeth creak. "What did he give you?" Grace held up the check. $10,000. Wet, wrinkled, but legible. 10,000, Elena repeated. For 5 years. For cooking, cleaning, hosting his dinner parties, managing his entire domestic life, and growing a human being inside your body. $10,000. He called it generous, Grace said. He called it generous, Elena echoed, and the way she said it made the words sound like what they actually were, which was obscene. She took a breath, visibly forcing herself to calm down. "Okay, what's the plan?" "I filed the response today. The court date is November 20th. 37 days. "And your lawyer?" Grace said nothing. "Grace." "I can't afford a lawyer, Elena. Legal aid gave me forms." I filled them out myself. Elena stared at her. You're going into a divorce hearing against a senior partner at one of Manhattan's biggest law firms, and you're representing yourself? He's using 3 attorneys from his own firm, on the firm's dime. Of course he is. Elena rubbed her face with both hands. What is he asking for? Everything. The townhouse, 0 alimony, $800 a month in child support, and a waiver of all claims to his assets. His lawyers say I was voluntarily unemployed and contributed nothing to the marriage. Voluntarily unemployed? He wouldn't let you work. He told you your job was the house. I know, but I don't have that in writing. The apartment was quiet except for the rain against the window and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Elena's apartment was small. A 1-bedroom walk-up in Queens with a kitchen that was really just a corner of the living room and a bathroom where you could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink at the same time. The couch Grace was sitting on would be her bed for the foreseeable future. It had a spring that poked through the left cushion, and the frame sagged in the middle, but it was warm and it was dry, and it belonged to someone who actually cared whether Grace lived or died. You can stay here as long as you need, Elena said. The couch isn't great, but the roommate is exceptional. Grace almost smiled. Almost. 3 weeks passed. Grace got her old job back at the Olympia Diner on West 46th Street, the same diner where she had worked when she met Dylan 6 years ago. He had come in one morning before a court appearance, ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and told her she had the most unusual eyes he had ever seen. Violet, like a character from a novel. She had blushed. She had written her number on his receipt. She had believed, with the desperate faith of a woman who had never been chosen by anyone, that this handsome, confident man with the expensive suit and the easy smile actually saw something in her worth loving. Now, she was back behind the counter, 8 months pregnant, wearing a maternity uniform that Elena had found at a consignment shop, pouring coffee for strangers and smiling through the pain in her lower back. She worked 4 shifts a week, $9.50 an hour plus tips, which on a good day came to about $60, and on a bad day came to about $30. She didn't complain. She had never complained about work. Work was clean and simple and honest. You showed up, you did the job, you got paid. It was the only transaction in Grace's life that had ever been fair. Elena watched her with growing frustration. Every night, Grace came home with swollen ankles and a brave face and a fresh stack of legal documents from Dylan's lawyers that got more aggressive with each delivery. The latest one accused Grace of intentionally becoming pregnant to extract financial support from Dylan, a claim so absurd that Elena had thrown the letter across the room and used language that would have made a dock worker blush. You have to fight, Elena said one night, sitting on the floor while Grace lay on the couch with her feet elevated on a stack of pillows. You gave that man 5 years. You cooked every meal. You cleaned every room. You hosted every dinner party. You managed his calendar, his dry cleaning, his prescriptions, his mother. That's not nothing, Grace. I don't have proof, Grace said, for the 100th time. His name is on everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. I was a ghost in that marriage, Elena. I existed to make his life easier, and I did it so well that there's no record I was ever there. She turned the locket over in her fingers. She did this often, running her thumb across the engraving, tracing the shape of the bird and the 3 initials, WRB. It was a nervous habit, like a rosary. The locket was old, heavy, made of a metal that never tarnished. It was the only thing she had from her parents, the parents she had never known, whose faces she had memorized from a single grainy photograph, and whose story she had been told in fragments by social workers who had more important things to do than comfort one more orphan in a system full of them. The story, as Grace understood it, was simple and sad. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 6 months old. There were no relatives, no godparents, no safety net. Grace had been placed in emergency foster care and had stayed in the system until she aged out at 18. The locket and the photograph were all that survived. It was Elena who changed everything, and she did it by accident. On a Tuesday night in early November, Grace was sitting at Elena's kitchen table, filling out yet another legal form, when she noticed the locket's clasp was loose. She tried to tighten it with her fingernail, and the clasp slipped. The locket swung free and banged against the table edge. Grace caught it and examined it. No damage, but the impact had shifted something. A tiny seam she had never noticed before was now slightly visible along the edge. "Is that thing broken?" Elena asked, looking up from her phone. "No, I think it opens." Grace pressed into the seam with her thumbnail. The locket popped open. Inside, on the left, was a miniature photograph, so small she had to squint. It showed a young couple, the same couple from Grace's larger photograph, holding a baby. On the right side, engraved into the platinum, in tiny, precise letters, were words. "For our Grace Eleanor, the world was dark until you arrived. Love, always. R. and M. Bennett." Grace stared at the engraving. Bennett. Her parents' name was Bennett. She had never known their last name. No one had ever told her. The foster care records listed her as Grace Miller, the name given to her by her first foster family. "Bennett," Grace whispered. Elena was already moving. She came around the table and looked at the engraving over Grace's shoulder. Then she looked at the initials on the back of the locket. WBWR. BWRB, Elena said. "If your dad was R. Bennett, then who's WRB?" Grace shook her head. She didn't know. "Give me 20 minutes, Elena said, and pulled her laptop across the table. It took her 12. Elena typed WRB Bennett into Google. The first page of results was useless, random businesses, and LinkedIn profiles. She refined the search, adding Geneva jeweler, because the pawnbroker Grace had visited the week before, hoping the locket might be worth enough to pay for a lawyer, had told her the engraving style was from a specific Swiss jeweler who served only a handful of ultra-wealthy families. The third result was a Forbes article from 20 years ago. Elena clicked it. The headline filled the screen. William Russell Bennett, the reclusive billionaire who lost everything that mattered. The article told the story of a man named William Bennett, a technology and real estate titan who had built a $14 billion empire from a single patent he filed in his garage in 1972. He was described as brilliant, ruthless in business, and fiercely private. He had one son, Robert Michael Bennett, and Robert's wife, Maria. In 1999, Robert and Maria were killed in a car accident on the Taconic State Parkway in upstate New York. Their daughter, an infant only 6 months old, survived the crash. She was pulled from the wreckage by paramedics and taken to a hospital. And then, through what the article described as a catastrophic, bureaucratic failure involving misfiled paperwork and an overwhelmed child services department, the baby disappeared into the foster care system. She was given a new name by her first foster family. Her connection to the Bennett family was lost. William Bennett had spent the next 25 years and, according to the article, over $40 million searching for her. He had hired private investigators, forensic genealogists, and data analysts. He had petitioned courts, filed Freedom of Information requests, and personally visited over 300 foster homes across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. He had never stopped. The article included photographs. One was of William Bennett, silver-haired and granite-faced, standing outside a courthouse. The other was of his son, Robert Bennett. Grace looked at the photo of Robert Bennett, and the room tilted. It was like looking in a mirror. The same jawline, the same cheekbones, and the eyes. The exact same violet eyes that Grace saw every morning when she looked at her own reflection. Her hands were shaking so badly the laptop screen blurred. "Elena," she whispered. Elena was already reading. Her mouth was open. "Grace, William Russell Bennett, WRB, your locket, your eyes. The baby in the car accident." Elena turned to her. "Grace, you're his granddaughter." "That's not possible. That's a billionaire. I'm a waitress sleeping on your couch." "Your parents were Robert and Maria Bennett, R and M Bennett. That's what the locket says. Grace Eleanor, that's your name. Your real name." Grace sat perfectly still. The baby kicked. Once, twice, 3 times, like a tiny fist knocking on a door. I can't just call a billionaire and say I'm your granddaughter. He'll think I'm a con artist. He'll think I'm insane." Elena picked up her phone. "You're not calling anybody. I am." "Elena? No." "Grace, you are 8 months pregnant, sleeping on a couch with a broken spring, working double shifts at a diner for tips, and going into a courtroom in 16 days against 3 lawyers who want to take everything from you, including your baby. If there is even a 1% chance that this man is your family, I'm making the call. You can yell at me later." Elena called the Bennett Foundation's public information line. She got a recorded message. She left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and included the words, "Platinum locket, violet eyes, car accident, 1999, and I swear on my life, this is not a scam." Then she hung up, poured 2 glasses of water, because Grace couldn't have wine, and said, "Now we wait." They didn't wait long. 48 hours later, at 7 in the evening, there was a knock on Elena's apartment door. Not a casual knock. 3 firm, measured raps, the kind of knock that cost $500 an hour. Grace opened the door. A man stood in the hallway. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it could have been sewn directly onto his body. Behind him stood 2 other men in dark suits, hands clasped in front of them, with earpieces and the particular stillness of professional security. "My name is Sebastian Cole," the man said. His voice was precise, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "I am the personal attorney and legal representative of William Russell Bennett. May I come in?" Grace stepped aside. Sebastian walked in. He took 2 steps into Elena's tiny apartment, and then he stopped. He was looking at Grace's face. Specifically, he was looking at her eyes. Sebastian Cole had been William Bennett's lawyer for 31 years. He had been present the day Robert Bennett was born. He had been present the day Robert married Maria. He had been present at the crash site, standing in the rain, watching them pull a screaming baby from the wreckage. He had spent 25 years helping William search for that baby. He was looking at the baby now. She was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in a walk-up apartment in Queens, with bags under her eyes and a locket around her neck. Sebastian's composure cracked. Just for a second. His hand, the hand that had signed 10,000 contracts without a tremor, shook. He blinked rapidly. He cleared his throat. "Miss Miller," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "We received your friend's message. We ran a DNA comparison this morning using samples from our records against biological material provided to us by your foster care agency. He paused. You are Grace Eleanor Bennett. You are the biological granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. You are the sole surviving heir to the Bennett family estate. Grace sat down on the couch, not because she chose to, because her legs stopped working. Elena grabbed the kitchen counter. Grace's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked. I don't want money, Grace said. The words came out before she could think about them, before she could calculate or strategize or be anything other than exactly who she was, a woman who had been alone her entire life and wanted only one thing from the universe. I just want to know if I have a family. Sebastian's eyes changed. The professional mask softened into something deeply, painfully human. You have a grandfather, Sebastian said quietly, who has not stopped searching for you since the day you disappeared. He is downstairs in the car right now. He has been sitting there for 20 minutes. He was afraid to come up. Afraid of what? Afraid you wouldn't want to see him. Grace looked at Elena. Elena was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, one hand over her mouth. Grace looked back at Sebastian. Send him up. William Russell Bennett climbed 4 flights of stairs in a walk-up apartment building in Queens, and by the time he reached Elena's door, he was breathing hard. Not because he was out of shape. The man still played tennis 3 times a week at 78, but because his heart was doing something it hadn't done in 25 years. It was hoping. He had trained himself out of hope a long time ago. Hope was a cruel drug for a man who had spent a quarter century searching for a ghost. Every lead that went cold, every DNA test that came back negative, every private investigator who called with regret in their voice, each one had chipped away at the reservoir of hope until William had learned to function without it. He ran his empire on discipline, his household on routine, and his emotional life on the grim acceptance that he might die without ever finding his granddaughter. And then Sebastian had called him. We found her, sir. 3 words that cracked the dam. William stood in the doorway of Elena's apartment. He was tall, still broad in the shoulders, with thick silver hair and a face that belonged on a coin. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than the apartment's annual rent, and he was holding his hands together in front of him to stop them from shaking. He saw Grace. She was sitting on the couch, small and tired, and enormously pregnant, with dark hair and a face that made William's breath catch in his throat because it was his son's face. The jawline, the cheekbones, the quiet composure. But the eyes. God, the eyes, violet. Deep, unmistakable violet. The Bennett eyes. His wife had them, his son had them, and now this woman, this stranger who was not a stranger, this ghost who was suddenly, miraculously, terrifyingly real, she had them too. William opened his mouth to say something. He had rehearsed a speech in the car, something dignified and measured, something a billionaire would say to a granddaughter he was meeting for the first time. He had practiced it twice. He remembered none of it. He opened his arms. Grace stood up. It took her a moment because of the belly, and Elena almost moved to help her but stopped herself. Grace crossed the room. She was shaking. William was shaking. The distance between them was 8 feet and 25 years. Grace walked into his arms. William closed them around her, carefully because of the baby, and he held her. He held his son's daughter. He held the infant he had last seen being carried out of a wrecked car on a rainy highway. He held the girl he had searched for across 6 states and 2 decades and $40 million and 1,000 sleepless nights. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His chin trembled. His eyes filled. A sound came out of him that he had never made before. Not a sob exactly, but the sound of something that had been locked for 25 years, finally breaking open. Grace was crying. She pressed her face into his chest, and she cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child in a foster home, pressing her face into a pillow so the other kids wouldn't hear. She cried for every birthday no one came to, every school play no one watched. Every night she lay in a strange bed in a strange house and whispered, "Please, someone, find me." Elena was crying in the kitchen, making no effort to hide it, tears dripping off her chin onto the linoleum. Sebastian stood in the hallway, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the ceiling with the focused intensity of a man who was absolutely not going to cry in front of anyone, his jaw working, his eyes suspiciously bright. William pulled back. He kept his hands on Grace's shoulders. He looked at her face, memorizing every detail. "You look like him," William said. His voice was rough. "You look exactly like my Robert." Grace wiped her eyes. "I have a picture. It's all I've had." I know, sweetheart. But you have more now." William looked down at her belly. His expression changed. The grief and tenderness shifted, and something new entered his eyes. Wonder. Fierce and almost painful. "Is that my great-grandchild?" Grace nodded. She took his hand and placed it on the curve of her belly. The baby, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she somehow knew that a large, warm hand now resting on the wall of her world belonged to someone important, kicked directly into William's palm. William's face broke open. The billionaire, the titan, the man who had stared down corporate raiders and congressional committees, came completely undone. Tears ran freely down his lined face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your great-grandfather. I've been waiting a very long time to meet your family." Then the warmth left his face. It didn't disappear. It retreated, like the tide pulling back before a wave. What replaced it was something much older and much more dangerous. It was the face of the man who had built $14 billion from nothing. The face of a man who did not tolerate cruelty toward the people he loved. "Grace," William said, still holding her hands, "Sebastian told me some of what happened. I need you to tell me the rest. All of it." Grace told him. She told him about Dylan, about the 5 years of marriage that had really been 5 years of servitude, about the controlling of money, the isolation from friends, the daily erosion of her self-worth through comments so casual and so constant that she had stopped recognizing them as cruelty and started accepting them as fact. She told him about the anniversary dinner nobody ate, the envelope on the sonogram, the $10,000 and the order to leave, tonight, in the rain, 7 months pregnant. She told him about Margaret, about the champagne and the boxes, about the nursery, about the baby clothes in the trash bag. She told him about Brittany, the red dress, the smirk, the fresh start. William listened without interrupting. His face didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. He sat perfectly still on Elena's second-hand armchair, his hands on his knees, and he absorbed every word the way the earth absorbs lightning, silently, completely, and with the full understanding that something was about to catch fire. When Grace finished, the apartment was very quiet. William stood up. He buttoned his jacket. It was a small gesture, mechanical, but Grace saw it for what it was. It was a man putting on his armor. "Sebastian," William said. Sebastian stepped into the room. "Call the team. Every single one of them. I don't care if they're asleep, on vacation, or in another country. I want to know everything about Dylan Crawford. Every deal, every dollar, every lie. I want forensic accountants on his firm's books by tomorrow morning. I want a background check so thorough that I know what he ate for breakfast on his 10th birthday, and I want a seat in that courtroom on November 20th. Yes, sir. And the firm itself? Crawford and Mercer? William looked at Grace. Then he looked back at Sebastian. Buy it. Sebastian's eyebrow rose by exactly 1 millimeter, which for him was the equivalent of falling off his chair. All of it? All of it. Buy the firm, buy the building, buy the parking lot underneath it. I want to own the ground that man walks on before he walks into that courtroom and tries to take my granddaughter's child. Sebastian nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Grace could hear him speaking in low, rapid tones, the sound of a machine being started. William turned to Grace. The iron in his face softened. Pack your things, sweetheart. You and your friend are coming with me. There's a penthouse on Central Park West with your name on the deed. There's a doctor who specializes in high-risk pregnancies waiting to see you tomorrow morning. And there is a legal team that is going to make sure that the man who threw you into the rain never has the power to hurt you or your daughter again. Grace looked at Elena. Elena was leaning against the kitchen counter, mascara streaked, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had just watched her best friend's life change in real time. I'm getting my coat, Elena said. Grace moved into the Bennett penthouse the next day. It occupied the entire top floor of a building on Central Park West, 62 stories above Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the park and the skyline beyond. Grace's suite had a bedroom larger than Elena's entire apartment, a bathroom with heated floors, and a closet that was currently empty because Grace owned 3 changes of clothes and a maternity uniform. She stood in the middle of the bedroom on her first night, bare feet on the marble floor, and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, in the townhouse she had maintained for 5 years, Dylan was sleeping next to Brittany and dreaming of a courthouse victory. He had no idea that the woman he had thrown away had just been claimed by a force he couldn't comprehend. Grace put her hand on the window. The glass was cold. The city glittered. I don't want to destroy him, she said. William, standing in the doorway behind her, said nothing for a moment. Then he walked up beside her and looked out at the same view. I know you don't, he said. And that's why I love you already. You have your father's heart, he paused. But I'm going to make sure he can never hurt you again. That's not revenge, Grace. That's a grandfather's job. He kissed her forehead and left her alone with the skyline. That night, Grace lay in a bed that was softer than anything she had ever touched and stared at the ceiling. The baby was restless, kicking and turning, keeping her awake. She rubbed her belly in slow circles. It's going to be okay, Lily, she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken the name out loud. She had been carrying it in her heart for months, afraid to say it, as if naming the baby would make the loss harder if Dylan took everything. But Dylan wasn't going to take anything. It's going to be okay. The next 19 days moved like a military campaign. Sebastian Cole operated from a war room on the 48th floor of the Bennett Global Tower on Park Avenue. The room had originally been designed as a conference space for corporate acquisitions. It had a long mahogany table, 6 large monitors on the walls, and a coffee machine that ran 24 hours a day. Sebastian filled the room with the best legal and financial minds money could buy, and then he pointed them at Dylan Crawford like a cannon. The first order of business was the acquisition of Crawford and Mercer. This was accomplished in 72 hours through a series of shell companies and blind trusts, all perfectly legal, all designed to ensure that Dylan would have no idea his firm had changed hands until the moment it was most useful for him to find out. Bennett Capital Partners, a subsidiary of the Bennett Family Trust, acquired 51% of the firm's equity. The remaining minority partners, when approached with a buyout offer that was 30% above market value, signed with enthusiasm and discretion. Sebastian added a standard non-disclosure clause. Nobody talked. The second order of business was the forensic audit. Sebastian brought in a team of 6 forensic accountants from a firm that specialized in white-collar crime investigations. They were given unrestricted access to Crawford and Mercer's financial records, which, as the firm's new majority owner, Bennett Capital was legally entitled to review. What they found made Sebastian's blood pressure rise and his smile widen simultaneously. Dylan Crawford had been stealing from his own clients for 3 years. The scheme was not sophisticated. It was the financial equivalent of a smash and grab, relying not on cleverness, but on the assumption that no one was watching. Dylan had created a shell company called Crawford Solutions, registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, and listed it as an outside consulting firm on the books of several major client accounts. Each month, Crawford Solutions invoiced between $40,000 and $60,000 for consulting services. The invoices were approved by Dylan and paid from client funds. The sole employee of Crawford Solutions was Brittany Voss, who had no degree, no professional certifications, and listed her primary occupation on social media as lifestyle influencer. In 3 years, Dylan had siphoned $2.3 million through this scheme. The money had paid for Brittany's apartment, her car, her wardrobe, her weekly spa treatments, and a vacation to St. Bart's that Dylan had told Grace was a business trip. The forensic team also found evidence of insider trading. Dylan had purchased stock in a company called Tech Core Dynamics 3 days before Crawford and Mercer's client, Voss Industries, announced a merger with TechCore. The stock tripled in value. Dylan made $420,000 in a single trade, which he routed through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The trade was so brazen that the only explanation for why he hadn't been caught was that no one had ever bothered to look. The third order of business was Margaret. Sebastian's investigators discovered that Margaret Crawford had retained a private investigator named Curtis Webb, paying him $15,000 in cash to fabricate a psychiatric evaluation of Grace. The fake document claimed that Grace had been involuntarily committed to a facility called the Greenfield Psychiatric Center in Albany, New York, at the age of 16, diagnosed with severe personality disorder and deemed a potential risk to herself and others. Every word of it was fiction. Grace had never been to Albany. The Greenfield Psychiatric Center had closed in 1997, 4 years before the date on the fabricated evaluation. The doctor whose name appeared on the signature line, a Dr. Raymond Foster, had never been licensed to practice medicine in any state. Curtis Webb had created him from whole cloth. Sebastian's response to this discovery was to do nothing. He did not alert the authorities. He did not file a complaint. He did not warn Margaret Crawford. Instead, he carefully documented every detail, obtained a sworn affidavit from Curtis Webb, who was more than happy to cooperate once Sebastian's lawyers explained the difference between immunity and a prison cell, and he waited. He wanted Margaret to file the document in court. He wanted her to put it in a judge's hands. And then he wanted to detonate it in front of her. Sebastian was, at heart, a patient man. While the legal and financial machinery churned, Grace lived a life she had never imagined. She woke each morning in a warm bed. She ate breakfast at a table where no one criticized her cooking. She saw Dr. Patricia Weston, one of Manhattan's leading obstetricians, who monitored Grace's blood pressure, checked the baby's growth, and told her that her daughter was healthy, active, and apparently fond of kicking her mother's bladder at 3 in the morning. Grace spent her days with William. They talked for hours. He told her about her father, about Robert's laugh, his love of old movies, his terrible cooking, his stubborn insistence on fixing things himself, even though he could afford to hire anyone. He told her about her mother, Maria, who had been a cellist with the New York Philharmonic, who had once played an entire concerto with a broken finger because she didn't want to let the orchestra down. Grace listened to these stories the way a person dying of thirst listens to the sound of water. She drank them in. She held them. She replayed them at night while lying in bed, building a picture of the parents she had never known from the fragments William gave her. William, in turn, listened to Grace. She told him about the foster homes, about the good ones, where the families were kind but overwhelmed, and about the bad ones, where she had learned to sleep with one eye open and keep her belongings in her shoes so no one could steal them. She told him about aging out of the system at 18, about the apartment above the laundromat that she shared with two other girls, about the series of waitressing jobs that led to the Olympia Diner where she met Dylan. "I thought he loved me," Grace said one evening, sitting with William in the penthouse library. "Nobody had ever chosen me before. Nobody had ever looked at me and said, 'I want you.' When he proposed, I thought it was a miracle. I thought someone had finally seen me." William was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He didn't see you, Grace. He saw an opportunity. There's a difference. I know that now." "Good, because what's about to happen in that courtroom is going to change everything. And I need you to know, not believe, not hope, know that you deserve every bit of it." Grace touched her locket. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I know. You're doing it for her." He nodded at her belly. "And that's exactly right." On the evening of November 19th, the night before the hearing, Grace stood at the window of the penthouse and watched the lights of Central Park below. Elena was in the kitchen, stress-eating popcorn and reviewing the timeline Sebastian had given them. Sebastian himself had gone home at 10, which for him was early, to get what he called tactical rest. William came and stood beside Grace. "You can't sleep," he said. "No." "What are you thinking about?" Grace pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "I'm thinking about what happens when he sees me tomorrow, when he realizes what I am, what we are. Are you afraid?" "No, I'm sad." She paused. "I'm sad because I gave him 5 years and a baby, and he never once tried to know me. If he had just been kind, William, if he had just been a decent husband, he never would have lost me, and he never would have known what I was worth. He would have just had a wife who loved him, and a daughter who adored him, and a family who had his back. That's all I ever wanted to give him." William put his hand on her shoulder. "And that's more than he deserved." "Maybe, but it's what the baby deserved. A father who was present, a family that was whole." "She'll have a family," William said firmly. "She already does." Grace nodded. She touched the glass one more time. "I'm ready." Meanwhile, 12 blocks away, in the townhouse on the Upper East Side, Dylan Crawford was drinking bourbon and rehearsing his victory. He sat on the leather sofa that had replaced the one Grace had chosen. Brittany curled beside him, scrolling through furniture catalogs on her phone, and he imagined the courtroom. Grace wouldn't show up. He was almost certain. She had no lawyer, no money, and no fight in her. She had never had any fight. That was what he had loved about her, the total absence of resistance, and it was what he now despised. His lead attorney, a partner named Marcus Hale, had assured him it was a formality. If Grace failed to appear, the judge would grant a default judgment. Dylan would keep the house, pay minimal child support, and walk away clean. If she did appear, alone and unrepresented, the outcome would be the same, just with a more satisfying view. "By Thanksgiving," Dylan told Brittany, "this will all be over. You'll be Mrs. Crawford, living in the townhouse, and that waitress will be back at the diner where she belongs." Brittany smiled and showed him a photograph of a $7,000 baby crib. "I want this one, in gold." Dylan kissed her forehead. "Anything you want, babe." His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "I filed something extra with Marcus. A psychiatric evaluation showing she's unfit." The judge will see she's mentally unstable. We can push for full custody. Dylan stared at the text. Full custody. He didn't want custody. He didn't want the baby at all. The baby was an inconvenience, a biological accident he wished Grace had handled quietly. But custody was leverage. If they could threaten to take the baby, Grace would surrender everything else to get her back. It was a negotiating tactic, the same kind he used in corporate mergers. Apply pressure to the emotional center and watch the opposition collapse. Dylan typed back a single word. Good. He turned off his phone, finished his drink, and went to bed. He slept soundly. He dreamed of winning. He had no idea that 20 blocks north, in a penthouse that overlooked the same city, an army was polishing its weapons and waiting for dawn. November 20th, Manhattan Family Court. The building squatted on Center Street like a gray concrete headstone, its facade streaked with decades of rain and exhaust. Inside, the hallways smelled like floor wax and anxiety. It was the kind of building where lives were rearranged on a daily basis. Marriages dissolved, children's fates decided, fortunes divided, all of it processed through wood-paneled courtrooms by judges who had seen so much human misery that they could identify the liars before the first witness was sworn. Dylan Crawford arrived at 8:45 in a black Lincoln town car. He was wearing his best suit, a charcoal Brioni that he had bought with money siphoned from a client account, though he would never have described it that way. His hair was freshly cut. His shoes were polished to a military shine. He carried a leather briefcase he didn't need because his lawyers carried the real documents, but it made him feel important, and feeling important was essential to Dylan's emotional survival. Margaret Crawford sat beside him in the car. She was wearing a navy suit with pearl earrings and a thin, satisfied smile. She carried a leather folder in her lap, inside which was the psychiatric evaluation she had paid Curtis Webb $15,000 to fabricate. Remember, Margaret said as they approached the courthouse, if she shows up, which she won't, let Marcus handle it. You just sit there and look like the responsible parent. She's not going to show up, Mom. Of course she isn't. Where would she even get the subway fare? They both laughed. It was a dry, joyless sound, like two rattlesnakes comparing notes. Dylan's legal team was already inside. Marcus Hale, lead attorney, along with two junior associates from Crawford and Mercer, were setting up at the respondents' table. They had a stack of documents, several legal pads, and the serene confidence of men who expected to win by default. Dylan entered the courtroom. It was smaller than he expected, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with rows of hard wooden benches for observers. Judge Patricia Holloway's nameplate was on the bench. Dylan didn't know much about her, but Marcus had briefed him. Experienced, fair, by the book. Not the kind of judge who would be swayed by emotion. Perfect. Dylan sat down. He looked at the plaintiff's table. It was empty. He checked his watch. 8:50, empty. 8:53, empty. A small, warm flame of triumph ignited in Dylan's chest.